The Wars games have been a Nintendo staple longer than most Western gamers know. There have been entries on the NES, Super NES, and even the original Game Boy. While these games never made it to the West, the series finally got recognized by North American gamers when the entries on Game Boy Advance were released in the early 2000s. Advance Wars and Advance Wars 2 Black Hole Rising became Game Boy Advance classics. These were the must-haves on the portable due to their addictive strategic gameplay, charming pixel art, and high replay value. They were the perfect fit for the on-the-go gaming sessions and could be played at an easygoing pace. The last time Nintendo published a game in this franchise was Advance Wars Days of Ruin in 2008 for Nintendo DS. Instead of getting the new entry, Nintendo has set WayForward loose on remaking the first two Advance Wars in a single package. How does this remake fare? Find out in this Advance Wars 1 and 2 Reboot Camp review. When a game publisher is unsure about making a new game in a dormant franchise, they avoid the risk and effort of making a new game and will opt to remake or remaster one of the fan-favorite entries. It's hard to blame any publisher for wanting to give customers what they want, but why bother when bizarre changes are made? In the case of Advance Wars 1 and 2 Reboot Camp, the results are mixed. This version is not a lazy conversion like some of Nintendo's half-hearted attempts like Super Mario 3D All-Stars or The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD. There was some legitimate effort to give some purpose to this remake. Regretfully, some of WayForward's decisions were misguided and poorly calculated. Advance Wars 1 and 2 Reboot Camp is not on the same level as Nintendo's best efforts like Metroid Prime Remastered, and is stuck in a limbo of mediocrity. The core of what made Advance Wars and its sequel are here, but it's hard to not feel like the graphical overhaul is a step backward. The Game Boy Advance games had a very distinct pixel art style, and everything was very chunky and colorful. Sprites were defined and had a lot of consideration for every single dot used to make the most out of the 240 by 160 pixel resolution, ensuring no space is ever wasted. The new designs, art style, and 3D models do not have the appeal of the old graphics at all. The sprites in the old games are timeless. The new 3D graphics lack personality, and they look cheap and resemble something out of a mobile game. The impression comes off as looking flat with nothing popping like the boisterous sprites with inky black outlines. The art change does affect gameplay slightly, since it's harder to tell apart tanks without having to manually highlight a unit to make sure. The aesthetics also depict the battles as miniatures, which could be a throwback to how the box art of Famicom Wars DS used toys to convey battle. This is lame, because the increased abstraction of the war makes the story seem like a bunch of LARPers are playing board games instead of conducting actual war. The toy-like aesthetics prove to be the least of the problems facing the new graphics. The character art is drastically inferior to the masterfully drawn originals. In Advance Wars 1 and 2 Reboot Camp, characters are drawn in a wannabe anime-like style that is common in a lot of Western cartoons where the artists do not understand anime art. This results in a flatly drawn style where volume and anatomy are ignored. Ryo Hirata's art from the original games had a profound understanding of anatomy. There was a verisimilitude to his work, and it made the characters have a grittiness to them. Max was a burly guy with rippling and defined muscles. It was the kind of art seen in a beautifully drawn manga. In Advance Wars 1 and 2 Reboot Camp, Max's muscles look like balloons, and he is drawn by an amateur. His facial expressions make him look like a chubby soy boy instead of a lean and mean soldier with sculpted features. All character art is lacking detail and is overly slick, making everything look more artificial, as if it's all passed through several hands that scrubbed away all personality. Not only do the characters look very terrible, but they sound bad too. Advance Wars 1 and 2 Reboot Camp gives the cast voices for the first time, and one would think this would have been the easiest thing in the world to do. WayForward horrendously miscasts the entire roster. Everyone sounds off. Andy is voiced by a 30-year-old woman who is unconvincing as a teenage boy.
Hyper Repair!
Eagle lacks the fierce pride his dialogue suggests. Kanbei's dialogue has been rewritten so he doesn't condescend toward females. Max sounds like he's a soft-spoken wimp who has never lifted a weight. Nobody puts on a funny accent either, which is a missed opportunity since these characters are all meant to be national archetypes for different nations. None of the Black Hole guys have any German accents. Olaf doesn't sound Norwegian, and Sensei doesn't sound like an old Asian guy. The only character who feels like they were faithfully translated was Nell. Everyone else feels like a misfire. Any gamer who can get past WayForward's utterly embarrassing artistic stamp will find that the core gameplay of Advance Wars has been untainted. All in all, Advance Wars 1 and 2 Reboot Camp are the same addictive strategic games we grew up with in the 2000s. Advance Wars 1 and 2 Reboot Camp is divided into 2 campaigns, with the first one being the introduction to the core systems. There's a lot to consider when trying to take the field and dominate the enemy's base, or trying to win by annihilating the opposing army. Factors like which unit is effective against one another are simple enough, but when terrain, weather, and adjacent units are factored in, victory won't come so easily. The Black Hole Rising campaign is where the Advance Wars 1 and 2 Reboot Camp compilation truly comes into its own. The first campaign is very restrictive in comparison, and limits which CO can be used for most of the experience. Black Hole Rising introduces trickier COs, bigger maps, and enemy-specific factories that can infinitely produce foes. It is a beefier challenge, and a longer one too. The battles in Advance Wars 1 and 2 Reboot Camp are very well designed, mostly because they are lifted from the Game Boy Advance games. Even if you're a master tactician, there is still a little bit of a dice roll involved when attacking enemy units. There are ways to stack the odds in your favor, and that depends on who you choose to use as your CO. Every CO has its strengths and weaknesses which affect their units. Max gets boons that can boost the effectiveness of ground infantry and come with a CO ability to support this. Kanbei's units all come with increased attack, but at the cost of all his units being the most expensive to produce. These characteristics do change depending on if playing the first game or Black Hole Rising 2. The dynamic of the battles can drastically change depending on which COs are going to war. A map covered in snow is a map where most characters get limited movement except for Olaf. Does a map have a lot of water in it? Expect Drake to command the sea and be unbothered by rain. Just don't expect him to rule the sky. That's Eagle's territory. War can last a long time. Thankfully, not all of WayForward's additions are mistakes. Reboot Camp added a fast-forward function to speed through enemy turns to make the flow of battle more exciting. Battles can go on for over 30 minutes to reach past the hour mark, and that is when speeding through enemy turns. A suspension feature has been carried over for players who need to take a break mid-battle. The new graphics in Advance Wars 1 and 2 Reboot Camp do not honor the original vision of the Game Boy Advance game. At the very least, the gameplay is still solid. The amount of content is substantial, lasting over 40 hours. If you already have the original Game Boy Advance games and the hardware to play them, then it's hard to recommend this version. If you don't, then Reboot Camp is still worth it if you want a great strategy game.